welcome to Inside Syria. I'm Hazem Seeker. U.S. President Barack Obama has described the use of chemical weapons in Syria as a challenge to the world. And now the U.S. appears to be poised to carry out what Obama has described as limited, narrow military strikes against Syrian targets.
Young girls and boys gassed to death by their own government. Now, this attack is an assault on human dignity. It also presents a serious danger to our national security. It risks making a mockery of the global prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. It endangers our friends and our partners along Syria's borders, including Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq. It could lead to escalating use of chemical weapons or their proliferation to terrorist groups who would do our people harm. In a world with many dangers, this menace must be confronted.
But Russian President Vladimir Putin said proof must be provided of the use of chemical weapons.
As for the position of our American colleagues and friends who state that government forces have used weapons of mass destruction, in this case used chemical weapons, and say that they have evidence, let them present it to the UN inspectors and the UN Security Council.
So what ramifications could U.S. military action have in Syria and across its volatile borders? Turkey and Jordan are regarded by Damascus as hostile neighbors and could face repercussions. But it's Israel and Lebanon that are most vulnerable to any fallout from a U.S. strike against Syria. The head of Iran's Revolutionary Guard has said a U.S. attack on Syria would lead to the imminent destruction of Israel, in his words. Israel's defense ministry says the Iranian-backed armed group Hezbollah has up to 70,000 rockets capable of striking Israeli targets. Any attacks on Israel from Hezbollah could, of course, lead to retaliation against targets inside Lebanon. And sectarian violence in Lebanon, which has increased during the Syrian conflict, could further destabilize the country. Well, for more on this now, let's bring in our guest. Meir Javan-Danfar is an Israeli Middle East analyst and author of The Nuclear Sphinx of Tehran. He joins us from Tel Aviv. Gilbert Ashkar is a professor of international relations at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and joins us from there. And Pavel Felgenhauer is a Russian defense analyst who writes for the Novaya Gazeta newspaper. He's in Moscow. Good to have you all with us, gentlemen. Meir Javan-Danfar, let's start with you. What do you think are the likely consequences then of this limited U.S. military action on Syria?
I think the chances of a Syrian retaliation against Israel is relatively low. I think President Bashar al-Assad will try to contain the fight, because if he takes on Israel as well, he'll become engulfed in two fronts, one at home and one from Israel, and it's bad enough that the Americans will be attacking him. I think his priority will be to contain the situation. I think perhaps the only side which may or may not attack, and again that's not for sure, is Hezbollah. But again, I think that will depend on what the Iranian government will request from Hezbollah, because by attacking Israel, Hezbollah will be exposing its missile arsenal to Israeli retaliation, and without its missile arsenal, Hezbollah is going to lose its deterrence value to Iran against a possible Israeli strike against Iran's nuclear installations.
Well, what's the feeling inside Israel at the moment? I mean, how afraid is the general public of any retaliation against Israel should the U.S. bomb Syria? Because I know there's been a lot of reports of people getting gas masks en masse, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. No, people with families are very concerned, because Hazem, what really seems to rattle the Israelis here more than anything is the fact that President Bashar al-Assad is showing no mercy in using chemical weapons against fellow Muslims and fellow Arabs of his own country, not even another country. So the sentiment in Israel seems to be, well, if he doesn't have any mercy upon his own people, it's possible that he's not going to have any mercy upon Israelis who are Jews and the state of Israel, who has been at war with him for so many years. So better safe than sorry. Therefore, many people want to get their hands on gas masks, and in some distribution centers we saw people were queuing for many hours, and some people even panicking.
Gilbert Ashkar, how do you see the likely consequences of any U.S. military action in Syria?
Well, it all depends on what is targeted, and of course depends on the scale of the operation.
Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, it is this limited, these limited strikes that they're talking about. What do you think is likely to happen, at least in the immediate term?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the question is how limited it is. I mean, if we're speaking of just symbolic gestures, the consequence will be very, very limited, actually, except rising tensions in the whole region. But if, for instance, there is a targeting of the Syrian Air Force capability, this will have, I mean, a significant impact on the balance of forces within Syria itself. So it all depends on the choice of targets.
What do you think the potential fallout is likely to be inside Lebanon?
I don't expect anyone reacting within Lebanon to what is happening there, because I mean, I don't think Hezbollah, which is already heavily involved in Syria, has any interest in opening new fronts within Lebanon itself, and other forces don't match Hezbollah in terms of military capacity. So I don't think what is happening, what is being prepared now, having any direct impact on the situation in Lebanon, except of course the closure of the airport, which is to be taken for granted if you have missile strikes from the sea on the area of Damascus.
I know you referred earlier to the balance of power in Syria, and the American administration has said that they don't see this action as a form of regime change, or even intending to tip the balance from one side to the other. If that's the case, then what practical effect will these strikes really have?
Yes, exactly. I mean, if they keep to their word, and if they are not really, and I have every reason to believe that they don't want to change really the balance of forces, or except maybe very slightly, in order to reintroduce some let's say equilibrium between the forces. But other than that, it's obvious that Washington doesn't want the Syrian regime to fall. What Washington wants is an agreement with this regime, and has been repeating that for over 1 year now, and trying to convince Moscow to work together on this line, which is, you know, to try to get to something like what you had in Yemen, with the president there stepping down, handing power to the vice president, and all that within a basic continuity of the regime and the state. And that's essentially what Washington is contemplating for Syria. Washington is not in any way a supporter of the Syrian uprising, a supporter of the Syrian revolution in that sense, because it is not in favor of the overthrow of the regime, which is the main goal of the uprising. So that's why, I mean, I can very well believe President Obama when he says that it will be very limited strikes. And yes, I mean, that's very, very likely what's going to happen.
Let's get the view from Moscow then. Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian officials have said this past week that any US-led attack on Syria would be, in their words, a grave violation of international law. Now, there's a lot of people who would certainly agree with that, but how much is this about Russia wanting to maintain its own strategic interests in the region and with regard to Syria?
Yes, actually the rhetoric in Moscow has been stepped up. Today the Russian Foreign Ministry named the possible American strike on Syria blatant aggression, and the Russian president told journalists that accusing the Assad regime of using chemical weapons is unspeakable idiocy or hogwash. I mean, he used the Russian equivalent of that. So the rhetoric is very high, and Russia says it's totally opposed, and Russian president says it was a provocation, that the Assad regime did not use chemical weapons, that it is only advanced militarily, which of course just shows that Russian president is not very well rehearsed in military tactics, because chemical weapons are actually an offensive weapon primarily. So Russia wants to keep the Assad regime. there's a kind of consensus in the Russian expert community and within the military and diplomatic circles in the Kremlin that A, the majority of Syrians support the Assad regime, B, that he is fighting an army of outside terrorists, Al-Qaeda connected, and that he's winning this war, and that Russia and Iran must support the Assad regime and help him win this war, and that the regime may be defeated only by a foreign intervention, and Russia should do its best to prevent such an intervention. So that's the actual assumption, not just the propaganda talk, but actual assumption of the situation in the Middle East, looking right now from Moscow.
Well, as you referred to earlier, Russian officials believe that it is the rebels in Syria that were behind this chemical attack, but they seem to be the only ones who are saying that. I mean, what are they basing that on? Are they seeing something that nobody else is seeing?
Well, actually, right now, the argument is that Assad would not use chemical weapons ever because he would not use them. That's more or less the argument.
Why would he not use them?
Well, because he's winning the war anyway, and he would not do such a terrible thing.
But what specific evidence is there that says that the rebels were behind this?
Well, right now, the main line of the Russian propaganda is that there was no chemical attack at all, that there is no evidence of any chemical attack in Syria, that this is just lies and provocation, which more or less echoes what the official Damascus is saying. So we're fully backing them up.
Gilbert Ashkar, you were shaking your head to some of that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, the Russian perspective on that, I mean, the official Russian perspective, speaking of the Putin government, the Putin regime, is appalling. I mean, the reasons to say that the regime is winning anyway, if the Syrian regime was winning anyway, why would the regime have resorted to massive intervention from Lebanese Hezbollah and Iranian forces and forces from Iraq? I mean, at least the Hezbollah side is open and declared. So why would Hezbollah have taken this very sensitive and dangerous step of getting directly involved? So that was at a point when, as Hassan Nasrallah himself said, I mean, there was a need to support the regime, the Syrian regime, because it was in difficulty, and this allowed the regime to reverse the tide, to get on counter-offensive. But again, recent shipments of weapons and all that have enabled the uprising to again go on the offensive, as we have seen even in the Latakia region. And this area where this chemical attack happened is a very sensitive, very important area I mean, it's the immediate outskirts of Damascus, and this has been held by the opposition for a while. So, I mean, from the point of view of a regime that has no moral scruples whatsoever to use whatever kind of weapons, this is absolutely not surprising. You know, the BBC just very recently showed, and this was a direct testimony, the use of incendiary bomb on a school playground. The reporters were there and all that, and that was a bomb from a jet fighter, and no one says, I think, and no one can pretend that anyone but the regime has jet fighters in Syria.
Maia Javandanfar, we talked quite a bit about how Hezbollah figures into all of this, but how do you see Iran's calculations here, specifically the regime in Tehran? How are they likely to react?
Well, Hazan, there seems to be a gap in the Iranian leadership developing. We see the moderates such as President Rouhani coming out and for the first time saying that Iran condemns any side using chemical weapons, and this was backed by the Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. And, you know, they can't go and say exactly because of their own restrictions that we believe Assad has been doing it, but, you know, in Iranian nuances, in the parlance of Iranian nuances, this means that they're actually admitting also that they also believe that Assad has been using chemical weapons. But we have the hardliners who have got their last word on Syria, and this is of course Ayatollah Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guard. And they seem to want to continue with supporting Assad with the status quo. They see Syria as kind of a defensive shield. Their view is that today Syria, tomorrow Iran. So basically they want to continue supporting Syria, because if Bashar al-Assad falls, or if he becomes weakened, then that could weaken Iran's hands in the region. It could weaken Iran's hands in the nuclear negotiations with the P5+1, and also it could strengthen the hand of Iran's rivals in this region, namely the Saudis, and after that the State of Israel. So of course there is this argument, but however, for now it seems that Iran will continue to support Bashar al-Assad. I don't think they're going to enter war to support Bashar al-Assad, because Iran needs its own anti-aircraft systems and missiles to defend its own nuclear installations. They are far more important than President Bashar al-Assad. But they will continue to support him. However, I think after a US strike, Bashar al-Assad is going to turn into an even more expensive liability for Iran. And as we know today, Iran doesn't have as much money as before because of the sanctions. So I think the argument that whether Iran should distance itself from Assad will actually become more intensified after a possible US strike.
Pavel Felgenhauer, just picking up on what our guest in Tel Aviv just said there, is there a danger that Russia will end up doing the same with Syria, and the longer this war goes on, will it eventually have to cut Assad loose?
Well, that is basically possible right now, because of sanctions and because of the civil war. Oil production in Syria is almost zero, and the fuel for Syria, including the Syrian armed forces, which very much rely on heavy equipment, tanks and guns and other weapons which need a lot of fuel, is coming in from Russian oil companies and Russian tankers supplying them. Of course, a limited strike most likely would not disrupt that supply line, which is essential for keeping the regime of Assad running. But if there's there's an escalation, and no one can exclude an escalation further on, if say there's a naval blockade, and there comes a point where either Russia stops these supplies or begins to escort its tankers with its naval ships, daring the West to shoot over Russian bows. I mean, there's lots of possibility of not very controlled escalation of the situation after the American strikes. Because of the strikes and because of the situation inside Syria and around Syria. And that's where Russia does have a point when it says that this attack is going to destabilize the region, and its repercussions are unpredictable. They indeed are unpredictable, and Russia will have to make very serious decisions to evacuate its military personnel from Syria, maybe, and maybe cutting the supply line to Assad further on, or trying to keep both in the face of Western and allied military action. Right now, everything is up in the air.
But regardless of how Russia sees this potential attack by the United States, all of the indications we've seen from Washington over the past week are that this attack will happen. It's just a matter of time. Haven't they come to the conclusion then in Washington that they will be prepared to risk whatever the consequences are for their relations with Russia, because what happens in Syria matters more to them right now?
Well, the relations between Washington and Moscow right now are very, very bad. And they can, of course, become worse, at least in propaganda sense, but in real terms, they're already very bad. And that's already part of the calculus from both sides, that neither Moscow nor Washington right now can find any kind of quid pro quo on almost any issue, including Syria. And so now it's actually maybe to crisis management, to see that the fallout is not that terrible as it basically could be. So maybe that such strikes could induce some at least crisis management contacts between Moscow and Washington to limit the fallout. I believe right now Washington also wants to limit the fallout. That's why they are planning a very limited action. Though will that really turn out, what that action turns out into, no one knows right now for sure.
Maya Javandanfar, you wanted to jump in there?
Yep, Hazem, I'd like to continue with what my colleague in Moscow was saying. It's very important for both Moscow and Washington to ensure that relations don't deteriorate, because both of them are working on an important topic called the Iranian nuclear program. Both Washington and Moscow are part of the P5+1. They are cooperating together. They are on the same side negotiating against Iran. And I think this is very important for them to make sure that the situation doesn't deteriorate. I think the Americans have taken note that 3 days ago the Russian government decided to publicly state that it's going to scrap the S-300 missiles that it had sold to Iran in 2007. An agreement was signed, a down payment was made by Iran for those missiles, but Russia never delivered them. And 3 days ago the Russians said that now they're going to completely dismantle and scrap them. And I think this is something the Americans will look upon favorably. And I think this is one of the reasons I think that both sides, especially the United States, will make sure that Syria doesn't turn into an issue where the division that already exists over other issues such as Edward Snowden becomes even worse, and their cooperation over Iran becomes effective.
Gilbert Ashkar, as terrible as all of this has been, a lot of people will be asking why we are focusing on this one particular attack that killed more than 1,400 people by the US estimates, rather than the more than 100,000 who have already died in this conflict from bullets and bombs. Should the United States or anyone else, for that matter, have responded much sooner than this?
Yeah, that's a very good question indeed, and that's the reason why the Syrian people are very, skeptical about all this and about the intention of the United States in doing this. I mean, basically, what is at stake here is just a matter of U.S. concern for U.S. credibility in the region, which has sunk to very, very low depth recently. I mean, the United States has suffered a lot of defeats and provocations and humiliations, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, facing Iran, even from Israel's Netanyahu, actually. And therefore, I mean, all this is about, restoring some sense of credibility to the U.S. as a major power in the region. It is not really about helping the Syrian people. I mean, the very maximum that Washington could contemplate is helping, restore some balance of forces within Syria in order to increase the pressure on the Assad regime for a compromise, which is what Washington wants. I mean, it may have now come to the conclusion that the regime as it is will not compromise unless it faces a difficult military situation, and that's why since June Washington changed somewhat its attitude.
I want to ask you just briefly,
delivery of weapons.
Briefly, Gilbert, yes. in the minute or so that we've got left, what about this idea of doing absolutely nothing and let both sides simply, I mean, it is kind of a Machiavellian way of looking at it, I suppose, but this is sort of letting both sides just fight it out and drain down all of their resources. Bashar al-Assad clearly doesn't have many friends in the international community. Hezbollah and Iran, we know how many enemies they have in the West there. What about just letting all of this play out?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's exactly the kind of position they had at the time of the Iraq-Iran war, and happy to see both countries destroy each other. So in a sense, there was, the reason why Washington was not really showing any urgency in the matter is that to a certain degree it was fine for Washington to see the Syrian states being weakened through this self-destruction of the country. And of course Israel shares this perspective, but they don't want the regime to fall because because they fear the consequences of what would happen after that. That's why they want this kind of compromise that I meant.
And on that note, we've got to leave it. Thank you to all three of you, Maia Javandanfar, Gilbert Ashkar, and Pavel Felgenhauer. Thanks very much for your time. And don't forget, you can find this program and many more at aljazeera.com, and you can leave us your comments there too. I'm Hazem Seeker. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.